The land of southern Louisiana in 1852 breathed with humidity so dense it clung to skin like a fevered hand, pressing into pores, seeping into breath, filling lungs with the heaviness of sugar cane and sweat. The cane stretched to the horizon in regimented rows, orderly only in appearance, because beneath that careful geometry lay tangled roots, marsh soil, and generations of buried cries, the kind the earth learns to swallow when men force labor from other men. The Mississippi, slow but sovereign, curved like a lazy scar not far from the plantation, its waters carrying rumors from upriver, whispers from Natchez to New Orleans of uprising, punishments, markets, and dreams drowned in the current. It moved indifferent to human pain, yet every enslaved soul along its banks felt the river like a heartbeat, steady, ancient, witness to captivity and fleeting hope. On the Boisiere plantation, cane rustled under the late summer wind like whispered lamentation. The fields were in the grinding season's final stretch, that brutal period when heat did not relent and men bent for hours until their backs hardened into shapes. The world no longer recognized as once upright, once free. Overseers rode horses with whips coiled like serpents ready to strike, watching movements with eyes trained not on human effort but on output, calculating pounds and profit. Nearby, in half-hidden quarters made from rough-hewn boards, women cooked sparse meals and tended to children too young to swing cane knives, yet old enough to sense the currency of silence. Babies cried not in protest but in need. Older children hushed them with instinctive urgency, learning early what it meant to protect one another in a world that offered them no protection in return. Among the men forced into labor was a tall, quiet figure known as Isaac by those who spoke his name gently and boy, by those who wielded power like a blade. He was not loud nor outwardly defiant. His rebellion took the form of endurance, the kind that didn't shatter suddenly but thickened over years like tree sap. Slow, resilient, impossible to scrape clean. Isaac had been brought from Virginia years ago, sold south when his previous enslaver died and debts needed paying. He remembered hills once, colder wind, a mother's voice soft in the dark of his earliest memories, speaking words in a tongue he could no longer recall, yet could still feel in rhythm against his ribs when he tried to sleep. Louisiana felt foreign even after years, its air heavier, its cane taller, its cruelty more methodical. Here slavery did not merely exploit the body. It sought to grind the spirit into dust so fine it could be mixed into the soil like fertilizer. The plantation owner, Jacques Boisiere, believed himself a patrician of refinement. He dressed in tailored linen, carried a gold watch purchased in New Orleans, and quoted French poets while sipping coffee thick with chicory on his veranda. But gentility in this land was a veneer, a thin coat over violence, and beneath Jacques' manners lay a cruelty as cultivated as his cane. He enjoyed control, not just over bodies but over fear, speaking softly before striking hard, smiling as he reminded enslaved laborers that disobedience would bring consequences not only for them, but for those they loved. He believed the plantation thrived because of his discipline, never acknowledging the truth. It thrived because men like Isaac bore the weight of fields and bosses, because women in the quarters birthed children into bondage, because every stalk of sugarcane cut hid despair beneath its sweet sap. Isaac worked mostly in the lower fields, where the soil was moist and boots sank slightly with each step, slowing movement, exhausting muscle. His hands were thick, scarred from cane knives and rope burn, calloused so deeply that pain became layered rather than sharp. He rarely spoke, conserving voice and thought in a world where words could betray. But his silence was not submission. It was memory. It was calculation. He watched the overseers, Silas foremost among them, whose cruelty was less refined than Jacques', more blunt and raw. Silas lashed out frequently, especially when rum soured his temper, which was often. Isaac learned his patterns, his rhythms, the way his hand twitched near the whip handle when frustration stirred, the way fear flickered in his eyes only when Jacques appeared, reminding him that his power was borrowed, not owned. Evenings were the only mercy the enslaved knew, if one could call them mercy. After sunset, when fields fell to shadow and overseers retreated, men and women gathered in doorways and around small fires, tending wounds both visible and invisible. Isaac sat sometimes at the edge of these gatherings, eyes fixed on flames that sputtered as insects swarmed. He listened to hymns sung low, voices cracked from exhaustion yet carrying conviction, mixing African rhythm with Baptist cadence. The songs held memory, resistance disguised as praise, prayers stitched with coded hope. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, Isaac heard not just the voices of those around him but echoes from those who came before. Voices buried not just in soil, but in the marrow of living descendants. He had no religion forced upon him that he could trust, but he believed in ancestors. He believed the earth listened. He believed silence had limits. One night, as crickets droned and fireflies flickered like lanterns carried by unseen hands, Isaac sat beside an older man named Abram, whose back bore scars shaped like crossed rivers from whippings long past. Abram's bones ached with weather and his sighs sounded like history speaking. He told stories in fragments half-whispered to avoid punishment if overheard. Stories of an uprising in Virginia years before, of a man named Turner whose rebellion shook plantations like a tremor through soil. Stories of Haitians who rose and took their freedom by fire and sword, whose names slave owners feared like curses. Abram's voice trembled not from age but from memory, because he knew men broken too far to dream, and he knew men who dreamed too boldly to survive. Isaac listened, gaze still fixed on the fire, and somewhere in the marrow of his silence, something shifted, not new but sharpened, as if every injustice endured layered into a blade he did not yet draw. The catalyst came as catalysts often do, not dramatic at first, but creeping, accumulating weight until a single moment tipped balance. In the height of harvest heat, Silas dragged a young boy across the field, accusing him of dropping cane. The boy cried, breath hitching, stumbling as Silas struck him again and again, each blow punctuated by the dull thud of flesh yielding to rage. Isaac did not move. Movement meant death, but his jaw clenched. His breath steadied. Silas grabbed the boy by the hair and lifted his face toward Isaac as though challenging him, daring him to intervene, testing how deeply fear ran. Isaac's eyes met Silas's not with defiance but with a stillness far more unsettling. A quiet that did not break, a silence that did not flinch. Silas sneered and threw the boy to the dirt, spitting near Isaac's boots before turning away, satisfied with his display of dominance. That night, Isaac did not join the fires. He walked to the edge of the cane fields under a half-moon casting pale silver across swaying stalks. The earth smelled of rain even though the sky remained dry. He pressed his palm into the soil, fingers digging slowly, deliberately until dirt filled the creases of his skin. He did not speak. He listened, to wind moving through cane, to frogs croaking near marsh edges, to his own pulse steady as the river's flow. He remembered the boy's trembling body. He remembered his mother's voice long ago. He remembered every lash, every humiliation, every morning waking to labor not for survival but for another's wealth. And in that moment the quiet resolve inside him crystallized into something immovable. Violence would not erupt wildly from him. It would rise like the tide, slow, patient, inevitable. Freedom was not a dream anymore. It was a vow formed in silence and earth under starlit cane. When he returned to the quarters, the fire had burned low. Abram looked up at him and saw something different. Not anger, but clarity. He nodded once, an old man's blessing without words, and Isaac sat down beside the dying embers, knowing the season had changed even if the air still weighed with heat. The cane fields whispered. The river breathed. And history, patient as soil, waited for the moment when endurance would turn into action, when a man forced to bow would instead make the earth into witness and grave. The cane fields did not sleep, even in the hours before dawn when the sky hovered between charcoal and bruised violet, and the only movement came from wind brushing stalks like fingers through ribs. Isaac rose before the overseers stirred, long before Jacques Boisier stepped out to sip his chicory coffee, because habit had made him one with the rhythms of the land even as resentment made him something else entirely.
He moved quietly through the quarters, nodding to the women already kindling small fires to boil cornmeal,
to the elders rubbing joints stiff from decades bent beneath sun and command, To the youths barely into adolescence who woke not with childhood's stretch but with the wary eyes of those born into watchfulness, no one spoke to him, not because they feared him, but because they sensed the air around him had changed, like the charged stillness before a thunderstorm that might either break the drought or drown the field. The earth was damp beneath his bare feet as he walked toward the edge of the field, the rich soil clinging to his soles. This land had devoured so much, ashes of burned cane, sweat and blood, and countless hopes that never rose to breath. But it also held memory, layers of it compacted under plow and rain. Isaac knelt again, pressing his palm to the same spot as the night before, grounding himself in the earth that fed Cain and fed cruelty, but also held possibility. Far off he heard the dull clang of a bell from the big house announcing the start of the day, its tone cutting through morning like the voice of authority. When he stood, he did so not as a man resigned to labor, but as one who had begun to envision a world beyond silent endurance. There was no rush in him. Revolt was not a spark. It was sediment settling until it hardened into stone. Work began as it had every day, cane knives slicing, stalks falling with soft thuds, men's breaths heavy from the start. The overseers rode slowly up and down rows, eyes sharp for slackness, their presence a constant shadow even when the sun rose high. Sweat slicked Isaac's back, rolled down his temples, soaked his shirt until it clung to him. But his movements were precise, steady, neither faster nor slower than necessary. He expended no energy wasteful to survival. The boy Silas had beaten worked near him, hands trembling slightly as he grasped each stalk, breath catching when the overseer's horse passed too close. Isaac glanced at him only once, and the boy lowered his eyes. Not in shame, no shame belonged to him, but in reflex learned from pain. Around midday, Jacques rode out from the house, boots polished, coat pressed even in the heat, the picture of plantation elegance masking rot beneath. He surveyed his empire like a man convinced God himself co-signed his deeds. Men straightened slightly when he approached, women paused in the distance, children stilled under shade trees. Jacques enjoyed these moments, these reminders that his presence shaped the air, that power was not only held but seen. He stopped near Isaac, dismounted slowly, boots sinking slightly into the soil. "Strong labor today," he said, voice mild yet edged, the kind meant to sound benevolent but always measuring worth in yield. Isaac kept cutting, acknowledging with only the faintest nod. Jacques studied him a moment longer, something calculating in his gaze, as though sensing a shift but dismissing it as fatigue or heat. Power rarely feels threatened by silence. It misunderstands it. When Jacques rode away, Silas approached, face slick with sweat and irritation. He resented the owner's refined cruelty because he could not emulate it. His violence was blunt, ugly, unpolished. He stopped in front of Isaac, leaning too close, breath sour with last night's drink. "Owner says you working strong. Don't give him reason to think otherwise." Isaac continued cutting cane, blade moving in smooth arcs. Silas's jaw tightened. "Look at me when I talk to you." Isaac paused, lifted his gaze. Not defiant, simply steady. For a heartbeat, something flickered across Silas's face that looked almost like unease. Then he spat in the dirt and rode off, whip dangling loose. Isaac returned to the rhythm of work, the interaction leaving nothing visible behind, yet marking another notch in the quiet accumulation of resolve. By late afternoon, the heat softened slightly, though exhaustion weighed heavier. Women gathered water buckets and moved along the rows, offering gourdfuls to the men. A woman named Alma approached Isaac, her eyes soft but searching. She knew what he carried. She had seen the same tightening in her own brother years before he disappeared into the swamp one night and was never seen again. Whether free or dead, no one knew. She offered him water, and as he drank, her voice barely whispered, "Storm coming." She did not mean weather. Isaac nodded once, not as acknowledgement, but as covenant. The boy beside him watched, clutching his knife tighter, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle cupped against wind. Dangerous. Precious night brought a near full moon, pale and heavy in the sky, casting the cane in silver waves. In the quarters, stew simmered thinly. Children curled near mothers, elders leaned close to recount scraps of history as though offering armor. The air buzzed with insects and unspoken things. Isaac sat outside, legs drawn up, staring toward the barn where tools hung neatly like instruments of both labor and obedience. Abram joined him, lowering himself carefully to the ground with joints creaking from a lifetime of bending. "So it begins," Abram murmured, not as question but recognition. Isaac did not answer. Words felt too frail. Abram continued, voice threaded with memory and fatigue. "Justice don't come clean in this land. It comes soaked in earth and consequence." Isaac's jaw flexed. "Earth takes what it must," he finally said, voice quiet yet carrying gravity deeper than sound. Abram nodded, eyes reflecting firelight and sorrow. "Then let the earth bear witness." The moment of ignition did not arrive with frenzy, but with calm, terrifying clarity days later, when Jacques decided to inspect the lower field drainage canals. Cain needed precise water balance, too much drowned roots, too little stunted growth. Jacques prided himself on understanding these details, walking the land as though strategy alone made him lord, forgetting the hands that carved channels and hauled soil. Isaac worked near one of the deeper pits that week, mud thick, the smell of wet earth rising rich and primal. Jacques approached on foot, gesturing to the overseer about an upcoming shipment, distracted by calculations and pride. Isaac straightened, wiping sweat with the back of his wrist blade resting at his side. Silas lingered only briefly before riding on, bored by the owner's agricultural lectures. Isaac watched Jacques step near the pit, boots sinking slightly, cane leaves brushing his coat. He stepped closer as if merely adjusting rows, as if routine still reigned. Jacques noticed him then. "Dig deeper along this edge," he instructed, pointing to a section where soil had eroded. Isaac met his gaze, not with fury, but with something older, heavier, carved from silence and endurance. Jacques' expression shifted from authority to faint confusion. Then Isaac's hand moved, not frantic, not wild, but with the inevitability of earth sliding into river. He shoved. Jacques stumbled backward, arms flailing not in command but in sudden helplessness, falling into the pit where mud pulled him like a grave waiting patiently. Isaac did not shout. He did not hesitate. He lifted the shovel and began to push soil back into the hole. Shovel scraping, earth thudding, each motion slow and deliberate. Jacques' voice broke in panic, then muffled between breaths and dirt, then dissolved into gurgling terror. Isaac's face did not twist. It remained calm, somber, like a mourner burying someone already dead in spirit long before body followed. Birds scattered from cane rows, wings cutting air in sudden alarm. A hush fell over the landscape, not silence but stunned recognition. In the distance, a woman carrying laundry paused, gaze sharpening as instinct conveyed what her eyes could not yet see. By the time the pit was filled, the earth looked undisturbed, merely another patch of field, damp and heavy. Isaac stood over it, chest rising slowly, shovel planted in soil like a marker. Not triumph, only completion. The river wind rustled cane as if exhaling after holding breath too long. Isaac turned, walking back toward the quarters, leaving the earth to hold its secret until truth ripened in time. Behind him the cane swayed, whispering in the dusk, and above the moon climbed higher. Pale witness to justice shaped not by law but by the weight of suffering turned resolute. There would be consequences. Storms never pass quietly in lands built on stolen breath. But for this moment, between labor and reckoning, between survival and uprising, the field stood still, and the land held what it had been fed, not sugar, not sacrifice, but the body of a man who believed himself untouchable. Isaac walked as though each step rooted him deeper into soil, no longer only a site of torment, but a ledger carved equal by his own hand. And somewhere in the darkness of the quarters, a hymn rose, soft and trembling at first, then steadier, carrying grief and fierce, quiet triumph into the heavy Louisiana night. The hours after Jacques vanished into the earth unfolded not like a fiery revolt, but like a held breath stretching across the plantation, taut, waiting to either snap or shudder into release. Isaac returned to the quarters without quickness, without furtive glances. Haste was what guilty men displayed, and he was not guilty in the reasoning that governed his soul. He walked through rows of cane as though he had simply finished another day's labor. Though the soil clinging beneath his nails was heavier than it had ever been, earth packed with the weight of more than clay and moisture. In the quarters, evening fires were being lit, smoke twisting upward into the purple dusk as women prepared meager meals and children clung to their skirts. When Isaac sat on the step of his cabin, no one asked where he had been. The hush around him was not fear, it was recognition. A spirit can change shape before a body ever moves, and his had shifted days ago. Abram approached slowly, bones stiff, voice low. He did not ask questions. Questions belong to those who did not understand that some acts require no telling because they echo loud enough without words. He looked at Isaac's hands, the dirt not yet washed away, and he nodded once. Eyes moist with pride and sorrow braided into one thread. "Land remembers," he murmured. Isaac lowered his head, not in shame but in exhaustion so deep it felt carved into marrow. The boy who had been beaten days earlier watched from a doorway, wide-eyed, breath tight in his small chest. Children recognized turning points even when adults pretended calm. He saw in Isaac not danger but possibility, the way a seed recognizes rain. Night deepened. Frogs croaked near the marsh edges. Cicadas droned their relentless song. Stars blinked through gaps in the heavy summer clouds. In the big house, candles flickered behind lace curtains. The silhouette of Silas pacing occasionally near the entryway. Jacques was a man of routine. He always returned from field inspections by supper, boots cleaned, coat brushed, appetite keen. When the clock struck and he did not appear, a subtle tension entered the house like a draft through a cracked door. Silas drank, grumbling about his absent master, convinced the worst he might find come morning was a horse thrown or a boot lost in mud. Plantation men did not imagine their own destruction. They feared rebellion only in distant abstraction. Their arrogance built walls taller than cane stacks, yet their blindness was the crack in every foundation they erected. Isaac lay awake long into the night. Sleep hovered but did not settle. Thoughts stirred like wind before a hurricane. He felt no triumph, only gravity. The earth had taken a body, but weight had returned to his shoulders in the form of time. Each passing minute drew the plantation closer to dawn, closer to discovery. Revenge was never a completed act. It birthed consequences. He did not fear death. Death was a familiar whisper in the quarters, but he feared how swiftly punishment might fall on others. Resistance, in a world built to crush it, always risked scattering suffering like seeds across innocent bodies. Before first light, the alarm began, not a bell, but shouts. Silas and house servants scoured the yard calling Jacques' name, their tones shifting from irritation to rising unease. Horses were saddled. Boots trampled wet grass. Torches bobbed along the path to the lower fields. The enslaved were roused, ordered to search. They moved silently, many already knowing the truth in their bones. Isaac walked among them, his face unreadable, steps even. When they reached the disturbed earth, Silas halted. The soil bore no dramatic mound, but plantation men were practiced in reading ground like ledgers, where boots had recently pressed, where weight had shifted, where dirt had been lifted and returned. His voice cracked as he bellowed for shovels. What followed was slow, agonizing. Each thrust of the shovel pulled back soil darker than night, heavier than sin. Isaac kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where dawn bled pink and orange through low clouds, a sunrise too soft for a moment so sharp. When the first hint of cloth appeared through dirt, a murmur rippled, half horror, half disbelief. Jacques' face emerged gray beneath smeared soil, lips twisted in a final frozen panic. Silas stumbled backward, breath sharp, then turned with fury, already searching for a target. Like a hound smelling blood but not yet locating prey, he shouted accusations at everyone and no one, eyes wild, whip in hand, though there was no one yet to strike. The enslaved stood in rigid silence, expressions controlled, bodies still as oak trunks. In them lived centuries of knowing that grief, even righteous grief, could not be shown. If joy flickered in any soul, it did so with the restraint of someone holding fire in their closed palm, willing it not to burn through skin, not yet. Isaac did not move. His stillness was a shield and a confession. When Silas's gaze landed on him, slowly like a predator choosing the largest animal in the herd, the air tightened. The overseer stepped forward, breath ragged, whip raised. "You," he hissed, fury trembling. But power, once cracked, cannot mend instantly. Other white men had gathered, including a local patrol captain summoned in haste. They saw the body, the disturbed soil, the row of stoic faces. Silas's rage demanded an instant execution. Yet protocol required semblance of law. A man of Jacques' stature required spectacle, not impulse. "Bring him," one officer ordered, voice icy but measured. Isaac did not resist as rough hands clamped around his arms. The quarters watched, mothers clutching children, men clenching fists behind their backs, elders murmuring prayers disguised as breaths. Alma wiped silent tears not for Isaac's capture but for the cost of resistance. Isaac was taken to a storage shed turned holding place, wrists bound, back against rough boards. The door slammed, leaving only a sliver of light. Alone, he inhaled air thick with dust and old grain. He felt no regret. Regret belonged to those who acted selfishly. He had acted as reckoning. Yet fear flickered, not for himself but for what might follow. Would others be whipped, sold to killed in retaliation? Cruelty rarely stopped at one target. In the quarters, the enslaved community gathered in quiet clusters. Some prayed aloud in trembling whispers. Some rocked silently. Some stared at the ground as though trying to read fate in dirt. Children clung to skirts. The boy who had been beaten days earlier sat with his knees pulled to his chest, tears carving tracks down his face, not from sorrow alone, but from understanding sooner than any child should that justice devours as much as it frees. Abram spoke soft words to those who listened, voice ancient with fatigue and fierce with truth. "A man got buried today who buried others in life. Earth done balance something even if cost ain't done yet." Silas stormed through the quarters before midday, whip trailing behind him like a serpent eager for flesh. He demanded answers, confessions, accusations. No one spoke. He struck one man across the back, then another, fury mounting with each refusal to break. But silence here was not fear, it was unity. Isaac had acted alone in hand, but not in spirit. Their quiet was shield, tribute, and rebellion all in one. Finally, red-faced and panting, Silas left to find rope and men willing to enact what he called justice, but what history would call retribution. Inside the shed, Isaac's thoughts moved slowly, carefully, like a man sorting grains from stones. He thought of the river's endless flow, of sugarcane rustling like whispered prayers, of his mother's voice he could barely recall yet always felt. He did not know if dawn tomorrow would find him breathing, but he knew something had shifted. Not just soil, not just one life, but the fragile illusion that power was absolute. Cruelty had been met not with plea but with burial. Whether that act birthed hope or catastrophe, time would reveal. Outside, clouds gathered, shading the plantation in muted gray. Cane leaves quivered as though carrying memory of something witnessed by sky and earth both. And in the stillness of a field once owned by a man who believed himself eternal, the wind whispered through rows in a tone not mournful, not triumphant, but resolute. Nothing here would return to how it was. Blood or freedom, consequence or awakening. Something irreversible had begun. The day after Jacques' body was lifted from the ground dawned with a stillness so unnerving that even the birds hesitated before singing, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting to see whether blood or truth would speak louder. The plantation woke early under a heavy sky, clouds low and swollen with the threat of rain, the kind that thickened the air and made the cane stand straighter, as though bracing. Word had already traveled beyond the fields, though no enslaved person had spoken it aloud. The master was dead, buried not by ceremony but by soil, taken not by illness or age, but by a hand long forced to toil for him. Rumors carried themselves. Whispers passed by glances, grief disguised as routine. But the enslaved did not rush toward hope. Hope was a dangerous thing. It lured men like sweet molasses, then drowned them in consequence. They moved through morning chores quietly, each step measured, every movement heavy with knowledge they could not speak. Every movement heavy with knowledge they could not speak. Inside the shed, Isaac sat with his back pressed to rough wood, wrists raw from the rope, his body aching not from struggle, but from the weight of holding still. Light seeped through a narrow crack near the roofline, painting a thin line across the dirt floor, like a blade drawn, but not yet swung. His breath was slow, steady. He had always known consequence could follow action. What he had done was not born of impulse, but of necessity that had ripened over years. Fear tried to creep toward him, the instinctive dread of death, but hope stood beside it, not for his own survival, but for the possibility that someone someday would walk these fields without iron at their neck or command in their ear. His heartbeat was not frantic, it was patient, rhythmic, like a drumbeat from a distant homeland he had never seen but felt in the marrow of existence. Resistance lived not only in the strike, but in the stillness after. Silas paced outside like an animal denied the kill, boots grinding gravel, curses spitting from between clenched teeth. His pride had been wounded as much as his authority, and wounded pride in men like him festered into violence that sought an outlet. But the plantation patrol had arrived, and their presence held him back for now. They wanted order, not justice, not humanity, but the kind of order that protected property and power. One patrol captain, a stiff-jawed man whose uniform buttons gleamed in the weak morning sun, surveyed the scene with a calculating gaze. He spoke to Silas in a low voice, words Isaac could not hear, but he could read tension by the silence afterward. This was no ordinary punishment. This was a moment that threatened the entire illusion of Southern mastery. If a slave could bury a master and live long enough to be caught, then fear, the currency plantation life depended on, cracked. By mid-morning, the plantation owners from neighboring estates arrived, summoned by rumor and curiosity disguised as concern. They stood near the veranda, discussing consequences with the solemnity of priests debating scripture, though their interest was economic and their piety was power. A public punishment would be needed, some argued, swift, brutal, undeniable. If mercy appeared, even in illusion, it might spread like sickness among the enslaved and ignite imagination. Others suggested a quieter handling, returning Isaac to the earth without spectacle, burying the incident like a scandal among polite company. But pride intervened. Jacques' death was humiliation, and humiliation demanded spectacle. Yet even as plans stirred among the white men, the enslaved gathered in invisible threads of solidarity. Women whispered prayers disguised as working songs. Men sharpened tools with more attention than required. Elders watched the sky, reading omens in cloud shapes and wind direction. A storm hovered just beyond sight, waiting for a moment to break. Children clung to mothers, sensing danger in the tension adults tried to mask. Alma moved like a shadow through the quarters, checking on the mother who had lost her infant weeks, before speaking soft words in the dialect of endurance. "Ain't nothing stay buried forever," she murmured, voice steady, eyes fierce. Abram, shoulders bent from age and scars, walked to the edge of the fields and stared toward the shed where Isaac waited. He remembered other men who stood at the precipice between life and death, men who fought, men who fled, men who surrendered. But Isaac had done none of those. He had chosen his path with the unwavering certainty of someone who had stopped fearing the outcome. Abram knelt slowly and pressed his hand to the soil. He felt the damp earth warm beneath his palm, as though pulsing. "You hold him now," he whispered, not speaking of Jacques, but of Isaac, of the spirit that had rooted itself deeper into the land by refusing to bow. "Hold him gentle." By noon, the sky had darkened further, thunder murmuring like a warning. The patrol captain opened the shed door. Isaac lifted his eyes but did not rise until commanded. Yet when he did, he moved with calm dignity. His wrists bled slightly when the rope was tightened again, but he did not flinch. Silas stood watching, jaw clenched, whip coiled like a promise. Isaac stepped forward back straight, every inch of him bearing history, not only his own, but the weight of all who had stood under sun and lash before him. He walked not like a man facing punishment, but like one walking toward truth. They led him toward the central clearing, near the great live oak that shaded gatherings meant to remind the enslaved of hierarchy, not belonging. Beneath its sprawling branches stood a wooden platform hastily constructed, ropes dangling from beams. The tree had seen many bodies punished, some broken, some scarred, some silenced forever, and its roots drank grief like water. Today it watched a different kind of reckoning. Rain began to fall. Not heavy yet, but insistent, tapping leaves like warning fingers. The cane rustled under the shifting wind, and a hush fell over the plantation as enslaved men and women emerged, not in defiance but as witnesses. Their eyes, locked on Isaac, their breaths held, their souls taut inside their frail but unbroken bodies. Silas stepped forward, voice strained with fury barely held in place by the presence of others. "This one buried his master," he spit. "He will learn what earth does to traitors." But when he tried to speak louder, to gather force, thunder answered him, a rumble that swallowed his words. He raised his whip. Lightning cracked the sky like judgment. In the split second of brilliant white, Isaac looked upward, not pleading, not praying, but acknowledging heaven and earth both. And then the storm descended. Rain slashed sideways, drenching fields, soaking hair and clothes, turning soil underfoot into thick mud. Wind roared through cane rows, bending stalks as though bowing in collective lament or salute. The platform swayed as Silas struggled to maintain footing. Men cursed, patrol officers stumbled, hats whipped from heads. A rope snapped loose from its beam, slapping wood like a verdict. For a heartbeat, chaos replaced ceremony. Isaac stood still, rain tracing lines down his face like tears he did not shed. The enslaved did not scatter. They held position beneath whipping branches and stinging drops, eyes shining in the storm's bruised light. Storms in Louisiana came hard and brief, but this one felt ancient, deliberate, as if summoned by a truth too long buried. Silas lunged again, whip raised, but a patrol captain grabbed his arm, hissing that discipline could not be carried out in such conditions. Not because mercy stirred in him, but because order required spectacle, and spectacle required control. "Wait," he commanded. Silas jerked free, face twisted, rage consuming what little prudence he possessed. "He dies now," he shouted. At that moment, lightning struck a cane row so close the crack shook the ground, a flash igniting a stalk for a brief second before rain smothered it. Horses reared, men lurched back in fright. Even the boldest instinct falters when nature roars louder than man. Someone shouted to take Isaac back to confinement until the storm passed. Someone else argued he should be shot immediately. Voices clashed beneath thunder. But the storm was not simply weather. It was interruption, a moment heavy with omen. And even the cruelest men sometimes hesitated when the world seemed to speak against them. Isaac remained still, rain dripping from his hair, chest rising slow as a tide. His eyes, dark, clear, resolute, swept across the faces of his people. He did not speak, but they heard him. Strength, grief, defiance, love, all carried in silence. No one smiled, yet something like pride seeped through the mud and rain, quiet as roots stretching unseen beneath earth. The storm would not last forever. Punishment would come. Isaac knew it. They all knew it. But in this storm, power wavered, soil, sky, and suffering aligned in a moment that transcended consequence. Sometimes history moves not by armies or laws, but by the trembling of a single afternoon when the world refuses to obey those who claim dominion over it. When patrolmen dragged Isaac back toward the shed, he did not stumble. The ground, soft yet firm beneath him, felt as though it held him up. The enslaved community watched, soaked, silent, unbroken. The storm eased, but its echo lingered, a reminder that nothing stands untouched when earth and sky decide to remember. As the last rumble faded, Alma whispered to a child clinging to her skirt, This land seen evil. Today it saw truth too. The child looked up, eyes wide, unsure what truth meant in a world like this, but knowing one thing deeply. Something powerful had happened, and nothing, no whip, no rope, no lie, would wash it away. Night fell with a heaviness that did not lift when the storm clouds drifted east and the cane leaves stilled, dripping in the humid aftermath. The plantation held a silence that felt less like calm and more like breath caught in a throat. Waiting. In the quarters, lamps glowed dimly, fires burned low, and voices rarely rose above a murmur. Mothers rocked children who sensed the unease, whispering lullabies that soothed no one but gave rhythm to fear. Men sat close to doorways, knives tucked, out of sight but near enough to feel like protection, though all knew steel meant little against powder and patrolmen. Even the dogs, tied near the barn, whined as though aware something in the balance of power had shifted in ways neither they nor their masters could fully understand. Isaac, bound again inside the shed, leaned against rough planks, his body aching from cold and rope, his skin marked where bindings rubbed raw, but his eyes remained clear, unbroken even as exhaustion pressed heavy across his ribs. Inside, his thoughts drifted between memory and resolve. He let his mind walk through years like a traveler retracing a long road. Every day in the fields, every lash endured or witnessed, every whisper shared in the dark, every burial of someone taken too soon by labor, disease, cruelty, or despair. He remembered a woman who once braided sweetgrass into his hair as a child, humming a tune from a place he had never seen. He remembered a boy whose laughter once filled the fields before silence claimed him, after a punishment too severe for bones not yet fully grown. He remembered the sound of dirt covering small graves behind the quarters, mothers' wails swallowed by night so as not to disturb the ears of those who slept safe in the big house. Each memory formed a layer of truth, each one a grain of earth on the scale that had tipped the day Jacques met soil not as lord but as captive. Isaac did not cherish violence. He had been forced to live within its shadow for too long, but neither did he regret the moment he had chosen to stop breathing the world, as they had written it for him. Morning arrived without birdsong. The air smelled of damp soil and cane sap, and mist hung low across the field edges like veil and warning. Silas did not sleep. He had paced the veranda through the night, muttering, gripping his whip as though it alone tethered him to authority. Pride had infected him like a fever. To him this was not simply the death of a master. It was the insult of a system shaken. His system, the only one he knew, the only one that affirmed his place above others. In his mind, order must be restored not tomorrow, not in deliberation, but now with force. But plantation owners from neighboring estates returned that dawn, summoned again by urgency and fear masquerading as leadership. They came with longer coats, sterner expressions, and pistols visible beneath fabrics, carrying the weight of a class defending itself. Their presence told a truth. One man's death was threatening to become a story, and stories, when born among the oppressed, had a habit of spreading like fire through dry cane. They gathered again beneath the live oak, speaking in tones meant to convey control, though unease slipped through. Some insisted Isaac be made an example immediately. Others warned that haste might ignite further resistance. Old men with wealth spoke of discipline and order like scripture. Younger ones spoke of vengeance and warning like war drums. Silas demanded rope, demanded spectacle, demanded blood. But an older owner raised his hand, voice even but edged with centuries of inherited cruelty. Rage is a poor steward in matters such as these. If we lose order, we lose everything. They debated not life but consequence, not justice but message. And inside the shed, Isaac heard none of it but felt all of it in the weight of silence pressing walls and ribs alike. In the quarters, tension turned into a current that passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. Alma moved quietly among her people, offering water, pressing cloth to wounds Silas had inflicted the day before, holding trembling hands. She spoke little, words were heavy and breath precious when the world tilted like this, but her presence steadied those near her. Abram gathered a small circle outside his door, elders with backs bent by time but spirits calcified by endurance. They spoke in low tones, calculating possibilities. Some whispered of escape routes, swamps, maroon camps, distant safe havens whispered about for generations. Others insisted staying close was safest, that scattering now would only invite dogs and bullets. Fear squeezed their chests, but something else lived beneath it, a pulse that had grown since the day Isaac acted, a realization that the impossible had happened once and might again in other forms, other lives, other choices. The children watched everything, absorbing dread and hope like rain through soil. They saw their parents' taut shoulders, heard quiet prayers, noticed how eyes turned again and again toward the shed where Isaac sat, not as condemned man, but as someone who had changed the air of every breath on that land. A boy crouched near the fire pit, tracing lines in dirt, paths maybe, or graves, or words he did not yet know how to write. A girl hummed the soft chant elders used only when someone stood on the edge of life and legend. The wind whispered through cane in a tone that sounded eerily like mourning and promise entwined. By midday the decision had been made. Not mercy, never mercy, but a process. Isaac would be transported to the parish jail, questioned, then returned for punishment by law. Law was not justice. Law was a veil slavery war when it wanted to look civilized. But the delay meant something, time. Time meant breath. Breath meant possibility. Silas nearly shook with fury, his face red as cane burn. He stormed into the shed, whip in hand, spittle flying as he cursed Isaac for defiance, for audacity, for daring to stand as if he were a man equal in soul. Isaac did not bow his head. Even bound, even exhausted, he held himself upright. That infuriated Silas more than words ever could. He struck Isaac once across the face, the lash tearing skin. Isaac's head snapped to the side, pain flashing sharp, but when he lifted his gaze again, his eyes were steady as river stones. Silas staggered back as though struck himself. Rage trembled through him, but something colder crept beneath it. Fear, the kind that gnaws at men who realize dominance is fragile when one refuses to kneel. When they dragged Isaac from the shed to load him onto the wagon, the enslaved gathered, not in protest, not in riot, but in witness. Witness was power too. Isaac saw faces he had known for years, mothers with tear-shined cheeks, men with fists clenched behind backs, children wide-eyed, elders whispering blessings disguised as breaths. Alma stepped forward just enough for her voice to reach him without drawing focus. "We see you," she murmured, the words soft but carrying weight of a lifetime. Isaac's throat tightened, but he gave the smallest of nods, not wanting grief to swell into something that could break discipline among his people. As he stepped up onto the wagon, bound hands lifted slightly by ropes, the cane fields behind him swayed, glistening in sunlight breaking through thinning clouds. He looked once toward the horizon, where river glimmered faintly, where beyond the next bend lay worlds he would never walk but had dared to dream of. He was not naive. He knew what awaited could be worse than death, but he had lived beneath cruelty so long that meeting it standing felt like a victory carved into the earth itself. The wagon lurched forward. Eyes followed. Not a sound rose, not wail, not plea, not protest. Silence here was not surrender. It was reverence. Isaac did not allow himself regret, only memory. If his body failed, his deed would not. And as the wheels rolled toward the road leading away from the fields he had shaped and suffered in, a breeze cut through cane rows, rustling leaves like cloth on a mourning bench. It carried a whisper, not loud, not triumphant, but enduring. The land remembered, and it would not forget. The road from the plantation to the parish seat wound through miles of cane, cypress and swamp-edge scrub, the landscape vast yet suffocating, beauty and horror braided like twin vines. Isaac sat upright in the wagon bed, wrists bound in coarse rope, ankles tied loosely enough to walk but tight enough to remind him that every movement belonged to someone else. 2 mounted patrolmen flanked the wagon, rifles resting across saddles, boots slick with mud from the storm. Their faces bore a strained composure. A man might feel proud escorting a captured criminal, but a captured man who had buried his master unsettled pride and pricked at superstition. They kept glancing at Isaac as though his stillness concealed danger, as though resistance might erupt not from his muscles but from the land itself. Silas trailed behind on horseback, eyes fixed to Isaac's back like a nail hammered into flesh. Rage kept his spine stiff, but fear flickered behind his jaw, tightening each time Isaac turned his head even slightly to take in the world he was being carried through for what could be the last time. The morning sun broke through clouds in shards, lighting patches of field while others lay in shadow, as if the landscape itself could not decide whether to reveal or conceal the truth buried beneath its surface. Isaac watched everything: the slow sway of moss from live oaks, the glimmering sheen of cane leaves still wet from rain, the steam rising from earth warmed after a storm. He knew this land more intimately than its owners ever did. He had felt its heat like breath on his neck, tasted its dust on his tongue, carried its soil beneath nails and in wounds. The thought that his flesh might soon join it did not frighten him. It felt inevitable, almost fitting. A man who had spent every day beneath a sky that never belonged to him could find peace in becoming earth that could no longer be commanded by whip or decree. The wagon creaked, wheels sinking occasionally into soft patches before jerking free. Isaac's body jolted with each shift, and yet he never lost his posture. Stillness was not surrender. It was defiance in its purest form. The patrolmen tried not to look impressed. They failed. He had become, without trying, an object of awe and terror, proof that submission was not the only fate for a man in bondage. They did not speak to him, nor he to them. Silence stretched thick, a third presence riding with them, heavy as humidity, sharp as truth no one wished to say aloud. Humidity, sharp as truth no one wished to say aloud. At a crossroads where a rough-hewn signpost pointed one way toward the river port and the other toward the parish courthouse, the wagon halted. A patrolman dismounted to tighten the ropes, though they needed no tightening. Isaac met his gaze, eyes steady, and something in the young guard's face faltered. A flicker of doubt, a question unspoken. What if he was right? What if the world is wrong? The man looked away quickly, mumbling about procedure, but his hands trembled as he tied the knot. Silas barked an order to continue, impatience fraying his voice like rope rubbed raw. His fury had become his shield and his prison. If he let even a sliver of uncertainty pierce him, he would unravel like twine left too long in rain. When the courthouse roof came into view, whitewashed, imposing, columns meant to mimic ancient justice but standing instead as monuments to hypocrisy, Isaac felt no tightening in his chest. Inside that building, decisions had been carved that shaped lives like blades. Men who looked like gods to themselves and ghosts to conscience had sat in polished chairs and condemned countless people with strokes of quill and nods of head. Yet as Isaac was marched through its doors, chains clinking softly like distant thunder, it was not fear that filled the room, but unease. The guards who surrounded him did not drag him. He walked himself, each step measured, each breath deep, as though he were attending not his judgment but his own burial with dignity. In the holding chamber, where cracked plaster walls bore stains of time and misery, Isaac was seated on a bench and left under watch. The only other occupant, an older enslaved man awaiting sale after being accused of theft, glanced at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Word had already spread here, too, carried by whispers faster than horses. "You the one," the man murmured, voice hoarse. It was not a question. Isaac did not answer, but the silence confirmed it. The man looked at him the way someone might look at a comet, rare, terrifying, beautiful in its destructive truth. "You gon' die," he said softly. Not cruelly, but with the weary acceptance of someone who had seen too much life to believe in miracles. Isaac nodded. "But I ain't dead yet," he answered, voice low, steady. The man's lips trembled into something not quite smile, not quite sorrow. Sometimes that's victory. Hours passed. Outside the barred window, mule hooves clopped. Wagons rolled. Townsfolk murmured. Life moved indifferent to the fate of one man bound inside. Yet inside, time felt thick, stretching across each heartbeat like rope drawn tight. When a deputy finally appeared, keys jangling, Isaac rose before being ordered. He expected trial or something that pretended to carry its form. Instead, he was led down a corridor to the back of the building, where Silas and 2 patrol officers waited with hard expressions and a wagon hitched for return. There would be no formal hearing. The men had decided quietly, justice here would not be recorded. It would be buried like inconvenience. A trial gave voice. A killing gave silence. And silence was the master's favorite currency. As they loaded him onto the wagon again, Isaac looked once toward the far edge of town where free black men occasionally passed with papers, heads lowered, walking careful lines carved by laws designed to catch them. For a heartbeat he let himself imagine stepping down that road, shoulders unbound, breath unchained. Not dream, just flicker. Then he felt the rope bite his wrists again and let the image fall away. Freedom had never been given here. It had only ever been seized or stolen by those who risked everything and often paid with everything. The journey back was quieter. Even Silas did not curse now. His certainty had not returned. Rage had shifted into calculation. Killing Isaac at the plantation would satisfy his pride, but fear of repercussions from slave patrol superiors or neighboring owners lingered. Yet so did something darker, a need not just to punish but to reclaim dominance in the eyes of those who watched. He wanted Isaac's end to speak, but Isaac already had. The land had heard him. The people had heard him. And Silas, though he would never admit it, had heard him too. When the plantation came into sight again, Isaac inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of cane and earth, the same air that had shaped him and scarred him both. The enslaved saw the wagon before the white men did. Word moved like wind, quick, invisible, unstoppable. Doors opened. Work slowed. Eyes lifted. Children froze mid-play. Elders pressed hands to heart. They did not run toward the path. They stood where they were and waited. Bodies straight, faces solemn. Witness again, not resistance. Yet witnessing was resistance in a world that demanded they look away. The wagon rolled to a stop near the live oak once more. The rope, still dangling, had dried stiff in the returning sun. Isaac stepped down with help neither offered nor needed. Sweat and dust streaked his face. Blood dried along his cheek from Silas's earlier strike, but his posture remained unbroken. He looked at his people, not as farewell but as testament. No voice rose, no tears spilled loudly. Emotion here lived in marrow, not sound. Silas stepped forward, voice low, venomous, shaking beneath effort to sound controlled. "You thought you could change something." Isaac held his gaze with steady calm. "I did," he replied, not triumphant, not taunting, simply true. That truth hit harder than spit or blade. Silas's face twisted. He lifted the whip again, more to feel power in his hand than to strike with purpose. But before he could swing, a sound cut across the air. Not loud, not shout, but a hum. Alma's voice, quiet, trembling not from fear but from grief, coiled around strength. A hymn, older than the soil, older than the chains, older than the language of those who claimed dominion here. One voice, then another, then a low chorus rising like wind stirring grass. Not rebellion, remembrance. Isaac closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound wrap him like cloth from a homeland stolen but not forgotten. His lips moved without sound, not prayer, not plea, just acknowledgement. He stood not as victim but as man who had refused to bend. The trees' branches stirred, though no wind blew. Sunlight filtered through leaves like fractured blessing or judgment. Who could say which? Silas lifted his whip higher, but his hand shook now, and the hymn did not stop. And in that suspended breath between lash and flesh, between life and ending, the world felt as if it held a single fragile thread stretched between terror and truth, waiting to see which would snap first. The moment stretched so long it seemed time itself had paused, holding the plantation in a fragile tension where every breath, every heartbeat, every rustle of cane and shifting boot waited to see whether destruction or deliverance would descend. Isaac stood, body weary but spirit firm. The hymn threading through the air like ancestral breath returned to claim what history tried to erase. Mothers held children close. Elders leaned forth as though to bear witness with every fiber of memory they possessed, and young men clenched fists not out of desire to strike, but out of the unbearable weight of watching one man stand alone for what they all carried inside. Silas's whip trembled, arm lifted like a branch in storm wind. Rage and fear knotted so tightly within him that neither could fully command his hand, and then as though the world exhaled, The first note of the hymn faded into the next, deeper, steadier, like a heart resuming beat after a near-death stillness. A voice from the assembly of enslaved men rose, low but resonant, joining Alma's. It was old Isaiah, whose spine curved from decades of forced bending, whose eyes held storms older than the plantation itself. Then a younger woman's voice followed, thin but firm, threading harmony around sorrow and defiance. Silas's chest heaved, breath ragged, shock flickering through his face as though he realized the hymn was not only for Isaac. It was a shield, a declaration that they stood not as property but as people who remembered dignity even when the world denied it. That revelation could crack a man like lightning splintering tree bark. He swung the whip, but it snapped harmlessly against air, the motion breaking under hesitation. The leather fell limp, not striking flesh, and Isaac did not flinch. Not because he expected mercy, but because strength lived deeper than skin. Rage surged in Silas's throat, strangling itself into a growl as he tried again to summon power through violence. But even his own body betrayed him. Fear, tremor, doubt, something deeper still. The world he believed immovable had shifted beneath his feet, and he could not control it with a lash. Abruptly, another figure stepped forward from among the white overseers, an older man with calloused authority carved into his face and tobacco stains on his fingers. He laid a hand on Silas's arm, grip iron hard, stopping him from swinging again. "Not like this," he muttered, voice harsh not with compassion but with knowledge. "Not in front of them, not when they stand like this." He looked at the gathered enslaved not as people, not as equals, but as a force that, if provoked wrongly, could turn storm into wildfire. Power feared fire even when it held the torch. Silas's jaw clenched so tightly a vein pulsed at his temple. His hand fell, whip dangling uselessly at his side. For the first time in his life he lacked command over a moment he believed belonged solely to him. Isaac breathed slowly, his chest rising with steady resolve. And he looked at Silas not with triumph or hatred but with a gaze that held truth like an unblinking flame. "You cannot break me because you did not build me." Silas saw it, saw himself reflected not as master but as man exposed, petty and trembling before someone who had been taught to kneel yet refused to fall. That truth was heavier than the whip he struggled to lift. A patrol officer cleared his throat then, voice uneasy. "Take him. Finish this. Away from here." It was not mercy, it was strategy. Isaac was a man, but now he was becoming something more dangerous, a story. Stories born in fields and whispered through quarters, traveled farther than shackles could reach. If Isaac died under the tree, before eyes that saw strength rising from soil watered with suffering, then memory would bloom like rebellion, and nothing terrified them more than remembrance turned into action. Isaac was seized again, though not violently. Even the men binding him seemed reluctant to touch him firmly, as though he carried heat that might scorch them. He did not resist, but his feet did not falter either. The hymn softened but did not cease, echoing like heartbeat through humid Louisiana air. As they led him toward a clearing near the swamp path, where punishment could be carried out without witness but for trees and water and God, Isaac lifted his head and scanned the faces of his people one last time. He saw courage in their eyes, sorrow in their jaws, strength in their stillness. He saw children watching with a kind of worship they did not understand yet, mothers clutching hands tightly enough to bruise, men who looked as though their bones ached with the urge to storm heaven itself and drag justice down by force. Alma stepped forward as if drawn by gravity stronger than fear. Her breath trembled, but her voice did not as she called softly after him, "Walk tall, Isaac." It was not encouragement, it was command, a blessing spoken like a truth written before time. And he did. His shoulders did not bow, his steps did not falter, even as his body moved toward fate. His spirit walked toward eternity carved not in marble but in earth. They paused at the edge of the cane, where a stand of cypress trees marked the transition from cultivated cruelty to untamed wild. The swamp beyond whispered ancient secrets thick with shadows and unseen creatures. It felt like crossing a threshold not simply of land but of existence. Here death did not feel like punishment. It felt like return, One guard took out a cloth not to blindfold Isaac but to wipe sweat from his own brow. Isaac noticed and almost smiled, not with lips but with soul, because fear lived not in him but in the men who would send him to the earth. Death did not frighten the man who had buried his oppressor. It frightened the world that believed it owned him. A rope was tied around a low branch, crude, rushed, lacking ceremony. Silas stood back now, whip limp, breathing hard as though he'd run miles without moving an inch. Isaac looked toward the horizon one last time, where Cain shimmered and sky stretched vast. For a fleeting second, memory filled him, his mother's voice humming a lullaby, the warmth of sun on his back the day before he first held a cane knife, the taste of river water on his tongue when he snuck down to drink before dawn, the brief laughter of a child he once helped up after a fall. Life had been cruel, relentless, unforgiving, yet life had also been his. He had carved dignity from brutality, had taken back one truth before they could take his breath. A man is not owned. They placed the noose around his neck, rough hemp scraping skin, and Isaac inhaled deeply. Not fear, not surrender, recognition. He had walked the length of a world built to kill him. He had broken its illusion. He had returned the earth what it was owed. He had shown that even subjugated flesh could choose moment and method. Death could not unmake that. Before the stool beneath him was kicked away, Isaac spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with calm clarity that cut sharper than any blade. Tell the earth, I walked free. A tremor passed through Silas, through the guards, through the wind itself. The stool fell. The rope went taut. The world held breath again. Somewhere in the quarters a child began to cry, thin and high like breaking glass. An elder lifted a trembling hand toward the sky. Alma sank to her knees, not collapsing but kneeling in reverence. And then, silence, not hollow but sacred, filled the plantation like floodwater rising slow and unstoppable. The rope stilled. The guards lowered the body, not gently but not cruelly either. They left him there, near the roots that drank centuries of sorrow. They believed they had quelled danger, erased rebellion, reclaimed order. They were wrong. In the quarters that night, no songs rose, no fires crackled with casual conversation. Instead, people sat in circles, whispering Isaac's name like a prayer, a secret, a seed. Children leaned close, not understanding death fully, but understanding that something mighty had walked among them and had not bowed. The boy once beaten stood silent, fist tight, jaw set, not in anger but in vow. Isaac had shown him a path, not easy, not safe, but real. The earth, damp and fertile, held one more body now. But it did not hold silence. Roots listened. Soil remembered. Cane stalks rustled in a rhythm that was not wind but heartbeat, steady and rising. And in the land where a man once buried his master, a story took root, one that chains could not choke, one that lash could not silence, one that history would try to hide but memory would feed like soil feeds seed. The plantation did not sleep easy again. Freedom had not come. But belief had, and belief is where revolutions begin. Belief is where revolutions begin.